The day the Empire's Disruptors met 30 times compressed steel, the Grand Armada of the Third Hegemony dropped out of hyperspace with the practiced, terrifying grace of an empire that had conquered 4 spiral arms. At the vanguard sat the Imperatrix, a flagship forged from light-absorbing biosteel and glowing with containment fields so powerful they warped the starlight around its hull. On the command dais stood High Prefect Valen, his multifaceted compound eyes reflecting the pristine tactical holos. 10,000 kilometers ahead drifted the human defense line, a collection of squat, boxy, ungraceful vessels that looked less like warships and more like floating industrial smelting blocks. They lacked shields. They lacked sleek, aerodynamic cowlings or energy harvester vanes. They were jagged, charcoal-gray monoliths of blunt, uncompromising geometry. Valen let out a sound that, in the upper registers of the hegemony tongue, translated to a dry, haughty scoff. "Look at them," Valen purred to his weapons master. "Primitive, unshielded ore-barges. They rely on sheer mass because they lack the scientific enlightenment to harness magnetic deflection. Prepare the heavy molecular disruptors. A single volley will unknit their atomic bonds, turning their crude hulks into harmless clouds of space dust." "Weapons charged, High Prefect," the weapons master replied, his primary limbs dancing across the console. "Disruptor beams calibrated to phase lock on raw, unshielded metal, firing now." Across the digital expanse, the frontline hegemony cruisers blossomed with blinding sapphire light. 3 beams of concentrated subatomic disruption, frequencies capable of dissolving diamond mountains and shearing capital ship armor in a single pulse, speared through the vacuum, striking the centermost human dreadnought dead center. On the tactical display, the visual feed flared white. Valen smiled, folding his upper arms across his chest. He turned his gaze toward the chronometer, waiting for the structural collapse indicators to light up. 1 second passed. Then 2. Then 5. The white flare faded. The human ship was still there. It hadn't dissolved. It hadn't vaporized. In fact, it hadn't even scorched. The dark gray, boxy hull sat bathed in a faint, residual blue glow, the disruptor energy seemingly swallowed by the dense metal like a drop of water vanishing into a dry sponge. Valen's smile faltered. His eyes snapped back to the console. "Report. Did the beams refract? Did our targeting matrices misalign?" The weapons master stared at his readouts, his claws trembling slightly over the keys. "N-negative, High Prefect. The beams hit dead center, but the telemetry is reporting 0 structural damage. In fact, the localized kinetic sensors are registering thermal absorption." "Absorption," Valen snarled, stepping down from the dais. "Molecular disruptors do not absorb. They dismantle matter at the subatomic level. What are those hulls made of?" The sensor officer frantically cross-referenced the remote scab scans, his voice rising in an undignified screech. "By the ancestors, they aren't using energy shields or magnetic plating. Their hulls are solid blocks of hyperdense matter. 30 times compressed industrial steel and tungsten matrix alloy. They folded the molecular lattices over themselves 30 times using high-pressure gravitational anvils." Valen stared in horrified disbelief. 30 times compressed. That's absurd. At that density, the mass alone should drag their ships into gravitational collapse. "They reinforced the internal gravity dampeners, sir," the sensor officer gasped. "The metal is so tightly packed that when our disruptor beams hit it, the energy didn't find weak atomic bonds to unknit. It just heated up the surface layer by 2 degrees while the sheer mass distributed the shockwave across the entire ship." Before Valen could issue a frantic, evasive order, the human block ship shifted. There was no elegant maneuvering thruster whine, no shimmering warp field transition. A heavy, mechanical thump vibrated through the fabric of space itself, a kinetic discharge so violent it registered on the hegemony flagship's long-range sensors as a microquake. From the forward belly of the compressed steel monolith, a single launch tube spat a projectile. It wasn't an energy torpedo. It wasn't a smart missile with guidance thrusters or plasma warheads. It was a solid, unguided slug of pure, hyperdense tungsten, roughly the size of a transport shuttle, accelerated by a linear mass driver to 4% of the speed of light. Evasive maneuvers, Valen screamed, lunging for the command console. Raise emergency deflector screens. It was laughably late. The relativistic tungsten slug crossed the 10,000-kilometer gap in a fraction of a second. It didn't explode upon impact. It didn't need to. Carrying the kinetic force of a small asteroid concentrated into a single point, it punched straight through the Imperatrix's light-absorbing biosteel bioshields as if they were wet tissue paper. Crack! The slug tore clean through the bow section of the Flagship, venting 3 entire decks into the vacuum of space before vanishing into the dark void beyond. Alarms wailed in a deafening, crimson symphony. Sparks showered across the bridge as secondary consoles blew out in cascading electrical fires. Valen staggered back against his throne, clutching his primary arm where a jagged piece of shrapnel had grazed his scales. He looked up at the tactical holoscreen, watching as the rest of the human, primitive, fleet calmly rotated their blunt, square bows toward the frozen hegemony Armada. Across the fleet-wide comms channel, a dry, unbothered human voice crackled through the static. Attention hegemony vessels. This is Captain Miller of the Mining Freighter Cooperative. Stop shooting at us with your flashlights. You're scratching our paint. Move out of the shipping lane, or we'll start throwing the heavy rocks. High Prefect Valen wiped a streak of iridescent green ichor from his jawline, his multifaceted eyes wide with a mixture of terror and unadulterated disbelief. Around him, the bridge of the Imperatrix was a chaotic landscape of flashing red hazard lights, sparking wiring conduits, and frantic deck officers trying to reroute auxiliary power to the failing life support grids. The gaping puncture wound in the forward bow had depressurized an entire quadrant, and the ship was listing awkwardly to starboard. "High Prefect," the tactical officer shrieked, his avian plumage standing on end as he wrestled with his jammed control console. "The tungsten slug has compromised decks 4 through 9. Structural integrity of the bow is down to 42%. Valen gripped the edges of his ruined command dais, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. How? How is this possible? They are miners. They are haulers of raw ore. Where did they acquire the engineering capability to fold molecular lattices 30 times over? That is a state secret restricted to the Imperial Ordnance Division. Before the officer could stammer out an explanation, a secondary klaxon wailed across the bridge. The main tactical holoscreen flickered, resetting from the red panic state to show a wide-angle view of the human fleet. The boxy, charcoal-gray monoliths weren't scattering or fleeing. Instead, they were locking themselves into a rigid, geometric formation, a wall of brutal, unadorned industrial architecture that looked less like a battle line and more like an orbital quarry wall. And then, every single one of those 30 times compressed steel blocks began to glow. It wasn't the shimmering, hyper-advanced plasma glow of hegemony war engines. It was the dull, angry, white-hot heat of industrial induction coils operating at 400% capacity. "Sir," the sensor officer whispered, his voice trembling so violently the audio filter struggled to translate it. "They aren't running diagnostic scans. Their mass drivers are cycling again. And the telemetry indicates they aren't aiming at us individually." Valen's heart seized. Then what are they targeting? The entire Vanguard formation. They're concentrating fire on the fleet's geometric center. "All vessels?" Valen roared into the master comms panel, lunging past a shower of sparks. "Break formation, scatter, deploy full emergency shielding." It was already too late. Across the human line, a synchronized, earth-shattering thump vibrated through the fabric of spacetime, 30 mass drivers firing simultaneously. It sounded like the sky itself was tearing in half. 30 relativistic tungsten slugs, each weighing thousands of tons, and accelerated to a terrifying fraction of light speed, leaped from the bellies of the unpolished human barges. They didn't arc or dance. They tore straight lines through the vacuum, converging with mathematical, cold-blooded precision on the exact center of the hegemony vanguard. The impact was catastrophic. When the first 3 slugs slammed into the lead cruisers, the ships didn't explode. They simply ceased to exist as cohesive structures. The sheer kinetic energy turned the pristine, biosteel hulls into a pulverized cloud of glowing, vaporized mist in less than a millisecond. The shockwave from the simultaneous impacts rippled outward like a localized supernova, catching 4 surrounding cruisers in a wall of compressed plasma and flying shrapnel. In less than 3 seconds, half of the Grand Armada's vanguard was wiped from the star charts. Silence descended upon the bridge of the Imperatrix, broken only by the hiss of escaping nitrogen and the crackle of dying terminals. Valen slowly slid down the side of his command throne until he was sitting on the scorched metal deck, staring blankly at the empty space where an entire squadron of Imperial might had stood moments before. The invincible hegemony, conquerors of 4 spiral arms, had been dismantled not by superior energy weapons or stealth technology, but by industrial-grade metallurgy, heavy gravity anvils, and a sheer, insulting lack of aesthetic flair. On the main viewing screen, through the swirling cloud of glowing debris, the lead human dreadnought, still bearing its scratched, unpainted industrial hull and a stenciled hazard warning reading caution, heavy loads, flashed its external running lights twice in a casual, mocking rhythm. Then, the comms channel opened one last time, carrying a calm, unbothered voice straight to the broken flagship. "Hegemony vessel, this is Captain Miller again. We gave you your warning. Now clear the space lane, or we're going to use your flagship's bowplate to pave the asteroid belt. Have a nice day." The bridge of the Imperatrix was a tomb of smoke, flickering red emergency strobes, and the low, mournful wail of failing atmospheric seals. High Prefect Valen pulled himself up from the soot-stained deck, his claws scraping against the scorched metal of his ruined command throne. His multifaceted eyes were wide, bloodshot, and locked entirely on the main viewing screen. Out in the void, the vanguard of the Grand Armada, pristine symbols of 4 centuries of unbroken imperial conquest, was nothing more than a drifting expanse of glowing, subatomic dust and tumbling, severed hull plates. The sensor officer, his avian feathers matted with sweat and smoke, feebly tapped at a terminal that was half-draped in sparking wiring. High Prefect," the officer rasped, his voice barely audible over the hiss of venting nitrogen. The human fleet has ceased firing vectors. They are ignoring us." Valen blinked slowly, his chest heaving. "Ignoring us? After obliterating half our vanguard with industrial slag, they are ignoring us." "Yes, sir," the officer whimpered, pulling up a secondary telescopic visual. "They have re-engaged their cargo tugs and resumed their original trajectory. They're mining the outer rim asteroids. They've already deployed automated smelting drones." Valen stared at the screen in utter psychological paralysis. The most powerful military force in the spiral arm had just been thoroughly, clinically dismantled by a bunch of cosmic blue-collar workers who viewed an Imperial Armada not as a worthy adversary, but as a minor construction delay in their morning commute. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the bridge as the reality of their defeat set in. There would be no glorious retreat. There would be no vengeance fleet. An empire that fought with sleek energy weapons and elegant philosophy had no counter for an enemy whose entire military doctrine was based on 30 times compressed steel, gravity anvils, and an infinite supply of very big rocks. Valen slowly reached out, his hand shaking, and pressed the master communication toggle, not to challenge the fleet, and not to declare war. "Open a channel," Valen whispered, his voice hollow and defeated. "Audio only." "Channel open, High Prefect," the console crackled. Valen took a deep, shuddering breath, staring at the blunt, charcoal-gray silhouette of Captain Miller's dreadnought on the screen. "Captain Miller," Valen said, his haughty pride permanently stripped away. "This is High Prefect Valen of the Third Hegemony." A short pause static-head through the comms before a dry, unbothered voice replied. "Go ahead, Prefect. If you're calling to complain about the paint scratches on your flagship, you're out of luck. My crew's on break." "I am not calling about the hull," Valen said, closing his eyes in surrender. "I am calling to inquire about your procurement contracts. Specifically, where does one acquire a 30 times compressed tungsten matrix alloy?" A low chuckle rumbled across the speaker. "Oh, that? You can't buy it, pal. You gotta build it yourself. Start with a standard planetary hydraulic press, crank the SI up until your teeth rattle, and add a little elbow grease." A brief pause, followed by the sound of a metal mug clinking against a console. "Though if you're ever in the sector and need some tips on how to throw a real rock, stop by the cargo bay. We always have room for another hand." The channel clicked dead. Out in the silent expanse of the void, the human mining convoy continued on its steady, unyielding path toward the outer belt, leaving a humiliated empire in their wake, not with a roar of triumph, but with the steady, rhythmic thump of a civilization that simply had too much work to do to care about being conquered. The hum of the auxiliary turbine faded from a roar down to a low, rhythmic purr as the Clementine settled into a stable holding orbit just outside the rich, iron-heavy asteroid belt of Sector 9. Inside the cramped cockpit, Silas Vance leaned back into his repurposed leather recliner, nursing his terrible chicory coffee with one hand while tapping the edge of the master control console with the other. "Mac," Silas said, staring out the scratched observation viewport at the swirling sea of gray space rock ahead. "Status on the smelting drones." Mac's single duct-taped blue optical lens flared as he processed the telemetry. "All 20 automated extraction units are deployed and operating at 98% efficiency, Captain. The preliminary scans indicate this cluster is exceptionally rich. High concentrations of raw iron, nickel, and a dense veins of unrefined tungsten." "Good," Silas muttered, taking a sip of the bitter brew and wincing slightly. "Tell the boys in Rig 4 to set up the hydraulic presses. If we're going to keep our mining permit valid out here on the rim, we need to stock up on 30 times compressed blocks before the next hegemony patrol decides to drop by for a rematch." "Affirmative," Mac replied, his mechanical joints clicking as he punched a series of rapid commands into the central terminal. "Though, if I may note, Captain, based on the psychological telemetry we intercepted from High Prefect Valen's final transmission, I believe the probability of another unprompted Imperial assault in the near future has dropped to roughly 4%. Silas chuckled, a low, gravelly sound that shook the dust off the dashboard. 4% too high, Mac. Never underestimate the stubbornness of someone who spent their whole life believing they own the universe just because their ship is painted shiny. A sharp, static-laced beep interrupted the quiet hum of the bridge. Silas set his mug down and tapped the comms receiver. "Vance here, talk to me." "Captain," came the booming, cheerful voice of Chief Engineer O'Reilly over the speaker, sounding entirely too energetic for someone who had just survived a localized space battle. "You're going to want to look at your secondary sensor sweep. Sector 4 boundary. We just picked up a civilian transponder ping." Silas frowned, leaning forward over the console. "Another mining rig, or are the tax collectors trying a different flavor of cruiser?" "Neither, sir," O'Reilly laughed, a rich, booming sound that rattled the speakers. "It's a passenger transport. Looks like an old luxury liner that someone retrofitted with heavy-duty cargo skids and a couple of agricultural harvesters. They're hailing us on an open space frequency." Silas glanced across the cockpit at Mac. The synthetic gave a slight, mechanical shrug of his metallic shoulders. "Patch him through, O'Reilly," Silas ordered, his eyes narrowing slightly. A wave of electronic white noise hissed across the console, clearing away into the sound of heavy breathing, a faint background clatter of kitchen utensils, and a gruff, tired human voice speaking with a distinct frontier drawl. "Ah, hello. Is this the Independent Scrapper Cooperative? This is Captain Henderson of the transport vessel Wanderlust. We're a bit lost. Our starboard stabilizer is leaking hydraulic fluid, and we heard a rumor out on the subspace relay that if you need a place to bolt some heavy armor onto your hull and grab a hot meal, this is the sector to do it." Silas looked out the viewport once more, watching the distant, gleaming expanse of the asteroid belt as the automated smelting drones began their rhythmic, thunderous work, crushing raw ore into dense, impenetrable blocks of unyielding steel. A slow, easy grin spread across Silas's face. He picked up his mug, took another sip of the awful coffee, and keyed his mic. "Welcome to Sector 9, Captain Henderson," Silas said smoothly, his voice carrying clearly across the void. "Pull in right behind the Clementine. Watch your approach angle. We've got a lot of heavy rocks floating around out here, and our paint is already scratched." A wave of collective relief audibly washed through the incoming transmission as the battered transport ship heaved into view, its running lights blinking a warm, tired welcome against the dark velvet of space. Out on the frontier, the Empire could keep its pristine capitals, its glowing biosteel, and its laws written in blood. Out here, humanity was building something much stronger, one block of compressed steel, one cup of terrible coffee, and one salvaged ship at a time.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible stories. Hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads.